Hello, everybody. It's Saturday, November the 1st, 2025. New month, old theme. We live in an age of increasing paranoia about technology. Everyone seems to be fearful that technology is creeping all around us, perhaps about to colonize ourselves. In fact, we've done shows about the colonial power of AI, both in terms of us as humans and perhaps even our bodies. One of the most persistent images these days is of us staring at our cell phones. You can find it everywhere, both online and offline. You only have to go out into the world to see people staring at their phones. And pessimists, Luddites, suggest that this is a bad thing, but maybe it's a little more complicated than the current zeitgeist, the current pessimism about technology. My guest today, Vanessa Chang, has a new book coming out on Tuesday. It's called The Body Digital, a brief history of humans and machines from cuckoo clocks to chat GPT. And I don't want to put any words into Vanessa's mouth, but I know that she thinks that our relationship with machines is a little more complicated than some people might think. Is that fair, Vanessa?
Yeah, that's absolutely fair. I mean, I think you're right to identify the anxiety and paranoia, but that's something that's characteristic of our entire history with machines. And I think we have a lot of agency when it comes to defining that relationship.
Nice to have the agency word used in an optimistic way. Is our current moment, Vanessa, your book tells the history of the relationship between humans and machines from cuckoo clocks to chat GPT, which more and more of us are using. Are we living at a particularly unusual time in November 2025? Has the relationship between humans and machines always been a rather uneasy, complicated one?
Yeah, I mean, I think the relationship between humans and machines has been characterized by unease, but also by joy and possibility. One of the, I guess, organizing principles of my book historically is to kind of track that relationship from craft work to clockwork to code. So I think, the scale and reach of technology right now with AI and ChatGPT um, is new and can kind of prompt new and uneasy kind of fears. But there's a lot in history that instructs us. If we're thinking about, I could pick the earliest kind of moments like writing, or maybe about a century and a half ago with the advent of technologies like player pianos or even gramophones. Then I think we can identify a lot of the same same species of fear and anxiety.
Tell me about your own relationship with machines. I know you got a PhD in the history of technology from Stanford. You currently run programming at Leonardo,
Hmm.
which is an East Bay nonprofit focusing
Hmm.
on our relationship with technology. Why have you spent your life studying, thinking about technology?
I mean, it's hard to avoid living with technology, and I think so. I grew up in Southeast Asia. I'm from Singapore, and growing up, there was a lot of early adoption of technologies. I always think about just the ways in which I got on the internet about like age 14, 15, and pretty soon had a cell phone. I had a Nokia. I imagine you might have had one at some point as well.
Yeah, I certainly was around when everybody else had them. I've always had either Blackberries or iPhones.
I was tracking, my little brother could send SMS messages in school, in class, in his pocket. He didn't even have to look, just by touch and
Wow, that is
feel.
cool.
And it was just really integrated into our lives in such a fun way. I also had a pager. That was another liberation moment for me when I was about 14 or 15. And it always kind of struck me that these technologies were just being integrated in our lives in such quick ways, and we're thinking about them. As I got a bit older and I started to travel a lot more, and seeing the different ways different people and different cultures and technologies stage that relationship, it kind of struck me that we could allow them to colonize us, to use a word that you mentioned earlier, or to kind of have more more agency over it. You talked about my work at Leonardo. I work a lot with artists using really cutting edge technology. I'm currently running a lab for disabled media artists, kind of working with AI to create AI art that works against kind of very ableist deployments of the tech. Um, we don't have to accept the stories and the narratives that technology brings, and we don't have to accept the ways in which they're designed for us. And so, working with artists as well as kind of scholars and thinkers, I've always been surrounded now by people just trying to push the envelope and think and practice differently with tech. And that's a space that gives me a lot of hope and a lot of joy. I mean, also, the fear remains because we're in a time of kind of great change. But I like to think that people are kind of constantly working in creative ways with technology.
Yeah, it's interesting to me that you grew up in Singapore. I've been there a
Hmm.
few times. I'm struck by a number of things about it.
Hmm.
Firstly, it's completely man-made.
Hmm.
Perhaps more than anywhere else in the world, this remarkable achievement in political terms and particularly in economic terms. Secondly, it's very, very rich in nature. The parks are amazing. I think it's got some of the finest, certainly the most beautifully maintained parks in the world. Thirdly, of course, it is a remarkably innovative place. Maybe not quite Silicon Valley, but the richest country in the world, the most efficient, which has embraced technology perhaps as much as any other place in the world. And of course, it's also controversially political, and some people might describe it as authoritarian. It's certainly not
Hmm.
conventionally democratic. So, how do all those pieces come together in terms of your own narrative? Is Singapore the model or perhaps the anti model?
I mean, I don't ever see one particular organization or state as a paradigm for my thinking. I think, I try and find resources everywhere for how to think about things. I mean, Singapore is an interesting place because when it comes to innovation, um, it's powered by a couple of impulses, I would say. One is that history doesn't stretch as far in Singapore, in Europe, you
Yeah.
have really, really old buildings. You can't just knock them down. Perhaps you could take a hacksaw to the to the window of the Louvre, but in Singapore, it's if the building's like unless it's like 300 years old, which it isn't, then it's okay. Everything is ripe to be remade. And the second thing about Singapore is like in terms of resources, it's people. And so people and human resources have been fundamentally understood in the mythology of the kind of nation state as part of that building. So coupled with like particular Asian values, it creates a different kind of landscape for technological development than Silicon Valley, right? Which is kind of prides itself on a I don't know, move fast and break things model of innovation and this accrual of wealth for the few. So I think that like there's some ways in which Singaporean approaches to thinking and to um, kind of cultural exchange, but also how people should live together can work. I growing up, I felt a little stifled sometimes by being in Singapore, but now when I go home, my family's still there. I must say it's great to have like the trains work and be able to get me places rather than like and Singapore taxes
You're
cars
saying that
a
the
lot.
BART doesn't always work, Vanessa? Don't take it out on the BART. I was thinking in terms of the title of your book, A
Mhm,
Brief History of Humans and Machines. The thing
mhm,
that's left out of that, of course, is nature. And talking
mhm,
about quote unquote nature in Singapore, it's not
mhm.
natural, but it appears natural. Does our history, are there two stools in your history, humans and machines? Is the third stool or the third leg of this stool, is it nature? And does our understanding of nature
Mhm.
determine how we think about machines?
Yeah, I mean, I think that we live in a point in history where nature, the division between nature and culture and nature and technology is an artificial one. at this point, I mean, nature's technology's always been a part of nature. As soon as it's a part of the work that we do, that it's part of the natural world. And part of the way I see moving forward is to kind of think about ourselves as embedded within the natural world, to have commitments to nature, but not to nature as it, as some kind of pristine, untouched world.
Yeah, the Rousseauan version, a state of nature, the thing
Yeah.
that existed before we rotten humans came along and ruined it.
Yeah, I mean, we are nature, and everything we do now has impact on the natural world because we are part of the natural world. And until we are designing in a way that recognizes that, and recognizes not as well that everything that we do to the natural world we're doing to ourselves, um, we're not going to, I think, have a generative relationship with each other and with the world around us.
I spent the summer in the Maasai in Kenya, and of course, spent a lot of time also thinking about nature in that sense. You begin your history with the cuckoo clock, and we'll talk about that in a few minutes, why you begin with the cuckoo clock. But what differentiates humans from their relationship with machines compared to animals? Do animals, non-humans, have relationships with machines?
I mean, many absolutely have to now because they live in our world. It's interesting. I was reading about a critique of David Attenborough and the vision of nature that he's helped to steward over the several decades, and how it's a bit of a myth, right? That there's this depiction of nature, and somehow it's a place we can go, and there's no cars there, and there's no planes, and there's no boats, but they're always just out of view. And I think there was a more recent, I forget the title, recent documentary which started depicting the natural world as like, and birds integrated into urban life, and how they work with certain rhythms in the city to build their homes or to get food and all of that. So I think absolutely, animals are kind of part of the technological world because that's what we've done. And we also kind of had models. You talk about the cuckoo clock. A lot of the automata, which are kind of proto robots in the kind of 16th to 18th century, at that moment that the cuckoo clock was being developed, were facsimiles of nature. They were kind of um, a recognition of what we were building, but always we were trying to imitate nature. There's a really fascinating automaton from around that time called the defecating duck, which you could feed and which also defecated. And I think
Was
we're
it
always
a fake? Was it a trick, or was it for real? I mean, obviously the duck
yeah.
wasn't real,
No,
but
the duck wasn't real. You had to it was a fake. I mean, it was a system. You would put something in and it would come out. It wasn't, it was, the whole thing was a kind of performance, and there was a kind of channel through it. But it was always about this mimicry of nature, and kind of, I think when, at least with early technologies, this interest in aping or simulating nature in some way. And concepts like the uncanny and the uncanny valley can be traced to that tension, right? Like the closer we get to something that's more real, or the closer we get to mimicking nature, the stranger it is for us, even though that's something that humans always seem to be driven to.
let's get to the book. You call it The Body Digital. Why?
Well, I think a lot of the ways people have historically thought about digital technologies is that they're very divorced from our bodily experience. That we live on our phones, we live on laptops, and so much of it's conducted on a screen. And I'm really struck
As
by
this interview, of course, is being
right.
conducted, for better or worse, on a screen.
I am real though. I'm a real body in a real house. And I've always wondered about how we could think differently about that. What you showed us, this image of people looking at phones, like there's real palpable effects on our bodies, not just of how we use our technologies, but in every aspect of our embodiment. So I wanted to kind of return us to thinking about the place of our bodies as places we have experiences, connect to each other, make meaning, are in the world, have pleasure, have pain, and also connect that to the history of our bodies and technologies, because I think there's really important lineage there that can help us to understand where we are now.
How central is the body? Of course, in the foundations of modern philosophy, of Cartesianism, Descartes famously said, "I think, therefore I am." It made the body the center of a kind of ontological certainty in a post-religious world, maybe not a post-religious world, but certainly a more skeptical world. Does your body digital, which begins with the cuckoo clock and ends with ChatGPT, is it bound up in a way with our increasingly distant relationship with God, a degree of skepticism, whereas historically we as a species have been dominated by one kind of faith or other, one kind of version of deism?
Yeah, I mean, I take up to some degree, though it's not the center of the book, Cartesian dualism and the way in which this kind of mythological separation of body and mind has animated the way we think about digital embodiment. Um, when it comes to how that informs a conception of God, that's less of a strand in the book, though I certainly pick it up in thinking about how we construct immersive technologies and have this kind of myth of disappearance, right? When it comes to technology, this desire for technologies to disappear because we're trying to get closer to perhaps each other, right? And have these technologies disappear, much in the way an ephemeral God might allow us to. I'm really invested, though, in a kind of post-Cartesian embeddedness of our bodies that you can't really separate how you see or how you feel or how you touch or how you hear from the ways in which technologies facilitate that, but also conversely, how we shape those technologies to abet and kind of steward those processes of feeling, hearing, listening, touching, and looking.
Yeah, maybe if there is a God, maybe he or she is looking at us like we stare at iPhones. It would be entertaining for tech skeptics if there was an afterlife and they met God and they were on their iPhone, wouldn't be able to pay attention. And of course, the issue of God is very important in our current obsession with AI. You end there. As I said, I want to begin with the cuckoo clock, but before then, it's always seemed to me that with AI and ChatGPT, we seem to be creating the conditions for a new all-knowing God. Do you think there's any truth to that, and particularly in terms of our relationship with these new AIs?
I mean, when it comes to this idea of all-knowing and knowledge and contemporary LLMs, I think that knowledge is really circumscribed by a few things. One, it's the training set that is available to these LLMs, and that's certainly not all kinds of knowledge. It's books, websites, things that have been digitized, and so that's where you get some of the best and worst of humanity reflected at us. You also get behaviors that are encoded by developers and engineers and designers who have their own kinds of worldview and their knowledge. You also have, I think, what's a kind of invisible knowledge are the kinds of the kinds of labor that's required of people to curate that data. Often there are people in developing countries who are paid very little to
Yeah,
look
we've
at.
done a number of shows on that where you pull the curtain, and it's not machines; it's actually humans doing the heavy lifting.
So yeah, and then the knowledge that you don't, I think a lot of the major companies right now like to talk about multimodal LLMs as if that's some kind of that's like an adequate adequate facsimile of being embodied and living in the world. So, when all-knowing, sure, they know a lot of some things, but there's so many parameters that make that knowledge really problematic and limited and guided by imperatives to produce, to buy, to reproduce, for these companies. The book ends with ChatGPT, and the way it ends, each chapter of my book is organized around a body part. It starts with the hand, it moves to voice, ear, eye, and it ends with mind. And mind is the chapter where I talk a lot more about ChatGPT in relation to technologies of writing and the way in which AI can be understood, against the backdrop of writing as a way to extend our cognition and extend the way we think. So perhaps if we can not only build and design these tools to work in concert with, values that are coherent with a better, more empathetic humanity, but also use them in ways that can extend our thinking, then that's the kind of knowing, right? That's the kind of all-knowing that's worth participating in.
You end with OpenAI, but you begin with cuckoo clocks, very different kind of knowing, very different kind of physical and metaphorical image. Tell us about Vanessa, cuckoo clocks. Why are they such interesting machines historically in terms of our human relationship with machines?
Yeah, I think cuckoo clocks are fascinating for a number of reasons. One, as clocks, they're an expression and extension of clock time and time that as a particular way of organizing our world and how we spend our days and the way that they're linked to capitalist kind of modes of production. So, before you have clock time, you live by the rhythms of the day and your circadian rhythms and day and night. So that's one aspect of it. Cuckoo clocks are also kind of part of this historical moment when people and watchmakers are also building these automata. And these automata are, as I kind of mentioned earlier, facsimiles of nature. You have these kind of proto-robots of birds or of writers or, all these kinds of natural functions and processes that signify to some degree a dominance over the natural world. Like, hey, maybe we can kind of reproduce this these natural functions and to another degree these kind of human forms of creativity and craft in a way that signals a really key moment in the history of automation. So starting there, and I mentioned some earlier efforts at automata kind of from the 5th to the 11th century, but this cuckoo clock moment, I think you can really start to think about in the history of automation as something that we begin to automate these natural processes and figures and beings. And in return, this is the way we can think about a moment where we ourselves become automated. We become automated by the clocks. We become automated by technologies we're beginning to bring into our lives. This can lead a few centuries later into the Industrial Revolution and Taylorism and the factory, right? The way in which the natural world and human beings and bodies start to become systematized.
And not just in work, in play, in the way, I don't know, casinos in Las Vegas, of course, block out the sunlight to make you forget nature. Right. When we look at our cell phones, we're not just looking at them, we're fingering them, so to speak. Steve Jobs famously insisted that these should be touch machines, and it was one of his great geniuses to recognize that that's what people wanted. He said, we don't want what we really want. We want what I'm going to give you. And he gave us something that was missing a keyboard, and that's has shaped the last 20-year history as much as anything else. I know you also in your book talk about pianos. Is there a linearity, so to speak, in terms of our relationship between our relationship with machines and the way we caress a keyboard and the way we
Mhm.
caress an iPhone, of course, using not just our hands, but our eyes?
Mhm. That's a very rich question. Yeah, I think you're really onto something here. You know, I read a study this was some years ago, so I don't know if it's more, but it was in, I think, 2017 study that said the average user touches their phone some over 2,600 times a day. And power users might touch their phones 8,000 times a day, which is a lot of,
8,000, that's incredible.
isn't that wild?
So what is
That's
that, 24? I mean, that's, I don't know, 50, 100 times an hour.
yeah, yeah. Uh, that's a lot. That's a lot of touch. And you know what? I think what's interesting how we're touching our phones and perhaps touching each other less. The example of the player piano is an intriguing one to bring up in kind of counterpoint with that, though. I talk about the player piano, and by the player piano, I mean the pianola, which was invented about like the turn of the 20th century. These are mechanical pianos that I don't know if you've seen one. Many people might have seen them in films. They have kind of these lined punched rolls, and as you run the rolls through them, they play themselves. So what you see there is actually rather than this reiteration of human touch, this absence of human touch, that the player piano plays themselves. Even the foot pedals get played. And what's interesting, I think, about these is that, you know, they were very alarming to people. In the book, I talk about an essay called "The Menace of Mechanical Music" by Sousa, who was a composer of military marches and you know, someone who's very concerned about player pianos and also gramophones, recorded sound and recorded human performance, because they would kind of divorce us from our
Yeah, and
our
these are
human
so he
selves.
was writing in fear, I guess, of what used to be called a pneumatic player piano, something that
Hmm.
played itself.
Yeah, and you know, people. It was interesting. It was democratizing. It meant people who couldn't play the piano or couldn't afford to go um, to a performance could, you know, experience these performances live. And I think one interesting fact I found out when I was doing research on the player piano was that actually they were repositories of very specific performances. So a lot of 20th century musicians were kind of recorded. They would play, and their performances would be kind of punched onto these rolls. So in a way, you could, if you put a roll into these pianos, what you were doing was watching like a ghost of a performance. And so even if they're long gone, then that's their absent bodies were there. So um, there's a kind of like desire perhaps to kind of see that performance inscribed again. I mean, Sousa was super concerned that people would stop learning how to play piano, that or liking music at all. People wouldn't put the effort in, that people would use these machines in lieu of, you know, singing lullabies to their babies, which actually does happen. That's a
Yeah,
whole
and
history
one
there.
person who's given a lot of thought to this is the German cultural theorist Walter Benjamin.
Hmm.
He wrote a very influential work at the beginning or early 20th century, The Work of Art in the Age of Mechanical Reproduction. What does he tell us, particularly you mentioned the gramophone, in terms of our sense of art in an age of recorded music?
Yeah, I mean, Benjamin was concerned about he was concerned about the diminishing of the aura of the work of art, that when you had original works of art, that there was something contained in them, this aura of, call it authenticity, call it originality, and that by reproducing that, it would create more of a distance between that aura and that authenticity, and I suppose the essence of the original artist, and the person viewing or experiencing the artwork. And in a way, yeah, I think you're right. Sousa was pretty concerned about that. This replacement of human relationships by human machine relationships.
Yeah, it's interesting. Some of these debates have come up with the internet in terms of the making of music and who should be an author, and they've come up again with AI. You say you dedicate each chapter to a different function in the body: touch,
Mm-hmm.
mind. And what about sight? I know you've given a lot of thought to eyeglasses, which I'm wearing. I don't think of them as machines, but of course, Mark Zuckerberg at Meta is really pioneering the idea of AI glasses, which are the ultimate machine.
Mm-hmm.
What do you say about glasses? Why are they so interesting, Vanessa?
Well, you're right. People don't think about glasses as technologies. I think what's there's a couple of things that are interesting that go in a few different strands. One, they are technologies, and more interestingly, they're assistive technologies, right? They're assistive technologies, and people don't think about them that way because they're so widespread. And so I think about things like that in assistive technology, like things that are more explicitly assistive technologies, like hearing aids, in an electronic era, something that mediates between our experience of the world and our kind of lived experience of the world. Because if you don't have glasses and you need them, then you can't see that. And if you're designing for people who have accessibility needs, as people with eyeglasses do, then you start to design perhaps in a way that's more accessible and more just. That starts to get complicated when you're thinking about AI and AR glasses, because it isn't simply this kind of facilitation of looking, or kind of pure looking or pure listening. You get a lot of design choices and kind of algorithms in the way. I think with AI glasses, and they're kind of merging with AR. They're kind of AR AI glasses, right? The Orion
Yeah.
glasses. Uh, this idea that just like glasses, it's helping you see the world in a more authentic and clear way. It's assistive, that there's this lifting of the veil, perhaps, as one way of thinking about it. But actually, there's like an incredibly complex veil that's kind of pretending to disappear, that's pretending not to be there, but you have to participate, in a pretty proprietary system, um, to use them, and to use them in a way that maybe overwrites your social obligations to other people. I know people are pretty uneasy when if they know there's someone with AI glasses in their midst, right? It was kind of like with Google Glass a little while ago. When someone pulls up their phone and they're taking a picture, but if they're wearing something that's always on, then they're just participating in this proprietary system, and like God knows where your information's going.
Finally, Vanessa, where are we in this narrative? You end with ChatGPT, but of course, if anything, it's the beginning rather than the end. There's been more and more talk, some of it hysterical, some of it a little bit more circumscribed, about the way in which the chip is coming closer and closer to the body. Lots of talk. I haven't seen it recently, but there has been over the last few years, about how one big tech company or other is planning to implant chips in us. Governments implanting chips in some sort of age of surveillance.
Mm-hmm.
When that happens, which seems relatively inevitable one way or the
Mm-hmm.
other, what will that do to the body digital? Will that change our history of relationships with machines, or is it part of the narrative? Is it just
Yeah.
the next chapter in your history?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, they're here. They're not in the marketplace, but BCI, like you're talking about, brain computer interfaces, are certainly here. They're being tested and used in certain military contexts. They're being used in medical research. There are some people, I know quite recently, there's a project called Project Steno at UCSF, with a stroke survivor, I think it was, who lost the ability to speak some years ago and is speaking through BCI. So they're here. The question is if and how they come to market. And I think what you're asking is what that looks like. And yeah, I mean, I think that's absolutely a part of this history. You know, we talk a lot about this, and this returns to your question about kind of mind body dualism. this idea that we've got this brain and perhaps it's, contained in our skull and we can defend a little bit against that. But technologies have been changing our embodiment and our brains since as long as we've been using them. The conversation I try and stage in the book is between one of the early technology of writing, and AI, but also BCI is kind of part of that. Before we had writing as a technology, we had to be in space with each other. We had to talk, one to one, and then those words would disappear. Perhaps there were ways to kind of transmit them in a communal way, like through song and memory and all of that. But if you died, your thoughts died with you. When writing becomes widespread, you can write something down, and that means your thoughts can live outside your body and they can be extended in that way, and you can talk with people after you die. So our brains have always been shaped and reshaped by technology, and I think BCI are an extension of that. What is particularly fraught, perhaps, are the contexts in which they're used, and I think you're naming that. There's a lot of kind of corporate invention around that, and I think this connects too to the way we were talking about AI glasses, right? Like, who is designing who they are for, who's designing the use cases and choosing them, who's involved in the process, like who are the test cases here? Are they people for whom they want to live and work a certain way? Are they people who might live with or without disabilities? How do they factor elements like race, gender, class into them? So yeah, it is absolutely kind of part of the next chapter, but because of the scale and the kind of money involved and the capital investment in these things and who gets to do that, I think we need to make noise and make choices about the conditions by which that happens.
Agency, in other words. And it's not a new issue. The way you're talking about it reminds me of the debate between Socrates and Plato about whether stuff should be written down and the value of writing as opposed to the value of the spoken word. Socrates was skeptical. And of course, it was Plato's insistence on writing Socrates down, which means that we know him now. Otherwise, he would have been forgotten.
Right.
Fascinating conversation. Congratulations, Vanessa, on the new book. It's out in a couple of days. The Body Digital, A Brief History of Humans and Machines, from cuckoo clocks to ChatGPT. I can't think of a book that's more relevant in November 2025. Thank you so much.